Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Love, Sex, and Data Conference. Welcome back to those who are joining us from another session, and hello to those who are joining us now. My name is Shikha, and I'll be your MC for this panel. We're so excited to see all of you here today, and we've had some amazing sessions so far, but it's only getting better today and tomorrow. So I hope you stick around and explore our schedule for those events that interest you. We're about to start the panel Tan Ki Shakti, Man Ki Shakti, the psychosocial, the intersections of body and society. But before that, I would like to inform everybody about some of the languages we have available today. The session will be conducted mostly in English. There are translations available in ISL, which you can already see on the screen, as well as in Hindi and Marathi. To listen to the session in Hindi or Marathi, please click on the globe icon that you should be able to see on the lower bar of your Zoom screen, and it would be labeled interpretation. And if you click on it, you'll be able to select the language of your choice. And you can also click mute the original sound because that might disturb you. At the end of the panel, there will be a question and answer session. Audience members can post their question and answers in the Q&A box that's again at the bottom panel. And our moderator and panelists will go through the questions in the last segment of the panel. Just to remind everyone before I introduce our panel and lovely panelists that the conference is a space to rejuvenate, reflect, and learn together. Please engage with an open heart, compassion, and respect, even in disagreement. And I would also like to let attendees know that there is a resource list of helplines and referral services available on the conference website, if that is something you need. There is no tolerance for harassment of any kind. There's no tolerance of casteist or sexist slurs. And in the event of this, that person will promptly be removed. In case of any concerns you may have around safety or any complaints, you can reach out to the YP Foundation's internal committee or the conference safeguarding committee. You can refer to the chat box for these email IDs. And now I hope you're all comfortable and ready for an amazing discussion between people who are all researchers in their fields and whose work engages in different ways with this intersection of research of our bodily health and our mental health and society. The panel is called Tan Ki Shakti, Man Ki Shakti, the psychosocial intersections of body and society. And it developed under a theme of the conference called the body as data. The theme along with the panel was developed with some questions in mind. Who collects data and who are the people or bodies that this data is collected on? What is the dynamic of the relationship between them, be it the researcher and the subject or the therapist and their client? And how do these identities and the social locations of the people involved also change this dynamic? And then to talk about the body is to also talk about all of our bodies as researchers. As we go through our lives, each and every one of us collecting memories of pleasure, memories of pain. And then we could also speak of the data the natural world maybe reflects back to us about our bodies and ourselves. What changes can a pleasure positive approach and lens create in this vast ecosystem of research, data, people's bodies and their mental health and the natural world? And I'd like to now introduce our panelists, Aditi Patil, Gracy Andrew, Saisha M, and this panel will be moderated by Dipta Bhog. I'd like to first introduce Aditi Patil, who is a researcher and writer currently studying the drivers of illegal wildlife trade in India's Northeast. Her first book, Patriarchy and the Pangolin, is about two researchers, including herself, who, while carrying out conservation research in the jungle, discover that the greatest threat to endangered species is in fact Indian men and patriarchy. Gracy Andrew is a clinical psychologist and vice president and country director in India at Corestone. Corestone works in the area of emotional resilience and well-being and has implemented programs in government schools in Bihar and other states of India. Her work has for a long time engaged with adolescent health and mental health and creating training programs for youth. Saisha M is a grants manager with the Mariwala Health Initiative, an advocacy and grant-making organization in mental health. As a psychology student, her thesis explored community-based trauma interventions as an accessible form of mental health care. She also hosts the Origin Global Youth Mental Health Advocacy Fellowship in 2021. And our moderator, Dipta Bhog, has worked on research and education for close to 3 decades. Worked on gender and education, sorry. At present, she is the head of research, partnerships, and innovations at the Third Eye, a portal that seeks to put the feminist in learning. Her work has for a long time engaged with education, young women leaders, rural journalism, and she was instrumental in initiating Khabar Lahariya in 2002. Thank you to our panelists for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to this session, and over to you, Deepta.
Thank you. A very warm welcome to everyone on this afternoon, and I hope we'll have a very exciting conversation. The three panelists, Aditi, Gracy, Saisha, welcome to this conversation. And I'm most excited because as an educationist, one is always learning, and learning is a way of seeing our world, what we record, has changed dramatically in the last 30 years. And I'm very excited by this conversation, and I'm hoping that we will also have a rich discussion after that. I'd like to request Aditi to go first as the researcher and really explore ways in which the researcher herself, himself, or themselves is located in the research themselves, bodily, physically, mentally, and our ways of seeing and our ways of being are very much part of what emerges from our research. And Aditi has really produced something very exciting, which is talking about patriarchy in pleasurable ways. So I think I'll hand over to Aditi to go first. Yeah.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you, Shikha, for the kind introductions, and thank you, YP Foundation, for making me part of this panel discussion. I'm truly honored to be sharing the panel with such amazing and powerful women. Thank you, Dipta, for kind words about the book also. So I'll start by talking about the process of data gathering that I followed in my study, because the book also is based on my study. So the study was based on agroforestry. We were sponsored by the Gujarat Forest Department to carry out a study that would show the status of the implementation of agroforestry in the state. So as a background, I'll just tell you that there was a national agroforestry policy that came out in 2014, and it required all the states to adopt it in a way that they saw fit. So what Gujarat had done was that they had introduced certain saplings for free at the Forest Department nurseries. And so we had to go out and see how the farmers were taking those saplings and how they were planting it. Now, agroforestry was not a new concept. So farmers have been doing it in the country since historical times. There are three broad categories of agroforestry. Either you could plant trees on the borders of your farms, or you could intercrop them with crops like turmeric, or you could have full patches of trees entirely in the farmland, like eucalyptus or mango trees or cashew nuts. But what the policy had done differently is that they were trying to tie in farmers planting trees on farms with climate change, because they saw that if trees would be planted on farmlands, it would lead to an increase in the number of total trees, and thus the total carbon sink of the country would increase, and it would somehow lead to reduction of climate change effects. I've questioned this notion in my book, saying why while huge swaths of forests are being cleared for capitalistic economics and companies, why should farmers have this burden of fighting climate change effects? But then that's a discussion for another day. But when you go into the field, before that, there's a lot of homework that you have to do. I'm sure all the panelists here, everybody's a researcher, so they know that the homework that you do has to be really stringent, and the questionnaire that you develop for the interviews for any kind of social and environmental research has to go through ethical and all the ethical guidelines, and it has to make sure that your questioning of people does not harm them in any way. But besides that, Dipta was asking, who are you as a person when you go into the field, and how does your psychological, mental, and physical being there, how does that affect everything that you are studying? So I only speak about my experiences. So when I and my research team, we set out to study agroforestry, we did have a questionnaire and we did test it. But when you do the actual interviews, you often find that there are things that you did not accommodate for. And I like to believe that research is driven by curiosity. So it's very important to be open at any point in your research when you find that there are things that you did not accommodate for. And also, if you are a curious person, you consider yourself as a student in the field when you are talking to anybody. But when you are a student and when you are learning from people, it's also important to be on an equal footing for knowledge exchange. Now, different people treated us differently on field. We came across small and marginal farmers who would offer us chairs to sit on while they themselves would sit on the ground. So then in that case, I did not find it to be an equal footing for knowledge exchange. On the other hand, there were bureaucrats who talked to us patronizingly. So there are different things, and these are very really subtle things. But as a researcher, if you take note of these tiny things, then somehow in the later stages, you could tie into how these things were connected to the knowledge that you got or did not get. For example, in my case, because the study was only funding agroforestry and it only sought information about trees, we were sort of restricted not just by funds, but also the time that we would spend into looking for connections like gender. But again, like Dipta was saying, being a certain person on the field, for example, in my case, being a woman and my co-researchers, one of them was a guy, one of them was a woman, how did that affect? So we were directly, I mean, some things were really obvious, but if you're not looking for subtle things, it's very easy to overlook. One example I'll give is that when we were talking to a bunch of women farmers, we found out that they preferred mango trees, while the men preferred eucalyptus trees for planting on their farms. So there were reasons for this, which we discovered because we decided to investigate. It did not have the space in our questionnaire to go seeking out the reasons for why there was this difference. It should have been preemptively done as an exercise before the policy came out itself, or the state should have thought of it before they decided to give out saplings for free. But because they did not, and we were finding out such subtle things, and we thought that these things have an impact, so we decided to investigate. And then we found that men had attended certain village meetings in the village where they had heard that the forest department was giving out these saplings for free, and that when they sell the wood from these eucalyptus trees, it would give them profit. Well, fair enough. But when we spoke to women, a bunch of women from the same region, we found that the women preferred mango trees because they had their experiential knowledge, because they could not attend the village meetings and they did not know that some saplings are being given out. But their experiential knowledge said that mango trees would not only give them fruit for the family, but also provide them with shade and space for women to come around and gossip, which was, in their case, it was pleasure for them. They also said that the trees provide home and food for birds. So their view of everything was quite holistic. Now this is something that, again, we could have missed. But again, you have to think that how you're going to communicate such kind of data. So if the research design or the immediate research output that you have thought of does not give you space to communicate this data, then I personally feel that it's important to somehow showcase these subtle things in the data. In my case, I had to write a book, which is not exactly an academic output of the research study. And I should also tell you that the Forest Department did not give us the last installment of our funds. So we actually could not complete the study. Sorry, that might be a spoiler for some people who have not read the book. But anyway, so my point was that I feel that it's important to reach the most marginalized person in the study that you are doing that is anyhow connected to your research topic, because only then you will have a full picture of the demography's needs. Otherwise, some people might get left out. Then recognizing your own bias and positionality is vital. I think my own privileged lens was becoming an obstacle for the longest time. But it's important to take note of that moment and then work on it right there. Like I was saying, some bureaucrats and powerful men in the villages also saw us being women as a problem or just as a pain in their daily lives. And we were shooed away twice by 2 government offices. And it's true that we have all suffered from consequences of patriarchy, and we still do. But where and how, when we should fight it, that's a critical point. I mean, you have to be really careful as researchers also that your fighting of the patriarchy should not in any way harm the people that are living there, the women especially. And being fully observant about things that might not be directly connected to your research topic somehow helps just expand your knowledge and also opens up things for you. For example, in the study of agroforestry, wildlife, again, we were not funded to look out for wildlife or how it's connected, but things where sometimes they were quite obvious and sometimes they were just in your peripheral vision. So we came across a lot of wildlife. We came across turtles, there were rusty spotted cats, there were storks, drongos, baya weaver birds. So, and all of them were connected to somehow the farm ecosystem. So if anything changes in the farm ecosystem, it was implied that their habitat, the wildlife habitat, would also be changed. When we tried to communicate that to the forest department, we were just told that it's not part of the agroforestry study. But again, I feel that this is important, and these are little things that if research can take care of, it might just lead or open up ways to get these things into the policy or national legislation. So yeah, I think that's about how my positionality and the researchers' positionality in the research design. Yeah, Dipta, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I wanted to say that, the point you make about sort of fighting patriarchy or, ideas of patriarchy, agroforestry are not new. But I think what has been really good is that the end product was really about a new way of looking or new way of talking about patriarchy. A lot of us have been in the field. I don't know how many of us, we talk about patriarchy in communities, but we rarely talk about the patriarchy that exists at the intersections of the researcher, the person who's being researched, the department, state policy. And I really thank you for creating a new pleasurable experience of trying to understand patriarchy in new ways and new forms. I think that we as a society are so keen, and particularly India being, a society which is caste-driven also, that the segmentation that exists, we are always hierarchizing, we are always, tying things up. And this interrelationship that you're talking about between the natural world, the social world, and ways of seeing those, making meaning of those worlds is really, really important. And I think that it's a very important underpinning to the session and to the conference, because we are really exploring what are the ways in which our own ways of making meaning actually impact our ideas of ourselves, our bodies, how we experience our bodies. And what the mind says is very powerful, as we know. So thank you for that. I'd like to move on to Saisha, who's going to open this up a little bit more for us. Saisha is going to be talking about the frameworks. You mentioned, Aditi, about capitalist frameworks. How do these work really in the area of mental health, in the ways that we see and understand ourselves and our mental states? And really, it'd be good, Saisha, if you could also explore that a bit more, and of what are the new ways, or what do we need to do actually to change those ways of typically dividing, segmenting, as Aditi said, the mind and the body, segmenting one department from the other, segmenting pleasure and pain, all these sort of segmentations and binaries that we keep creating. How do we go beyond that? So over to you, Saisha.
And hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be a part of this super cool conference and to speak with you all about mental health data and pleasure. At Mariwala Health Initiative, we work to support rights-based, psychosocial, and community-based mental health work that challenges the dominant narratives on mental health. So I have found that ideas of pleasure, for the most part, are notably absent from the dominant ways we think about and work on mental health, and consequently conceptualize and collect data in mental health, which is slightly ironic as we are a field all about well-being. In fact, I think a lot of people's first interactions with the idea of mental health as codified and taught to us are perhaps ideas about diagnoses or specific disorders with a specific set of symptoms. And we may equate that being the crux of mental health work, where in reality, we all have mental health and everyone exists on a spectrum from well-being to stress, distress, and so on. And we move on the spectrum of mental health throughout our lives, whether or not we have engaged with or had a diagnosis. Now, while such diagnoses and diagnostic frameworks may discuss loss of pleasure as a symptom of mental health, clinical work or research work in the field rarely seeks to address what that pleasure may mean. And if pleasure is lost, how do we regain it outside of prescribed clinical goals of functionality? What I mean by that is that the dominant ideas of recovery from mental ill health are rooted in capitalist and ableist definitions. These dominant ideas hold that if you can keep a 9-to-5 job, if you can study and pass your exams, it means you are mentally healthy, you are well, you are in recovery, or even you are recovered. And that is sort of where the conversation ends. The mental health field at present is largely not oriented to document or protect pleasure in the work that is done. Rather, clinical frameworks or research frameworks in mental health mostly work to standardize or prescribe what is and isn't normal, drawing on definitions of normal that are powered by inherently exclusionary social structures. For example, non-normative sexualities, relationships, and other expressions of love have long been pathologized by the psi disciplines. Non-dominant and non-biomedical approaches to mental health that may draw on daily, inherent, accessible pleasures that can support one's well-being, such as arts, dance, play, and drama, are also often sidelined in favor of more dominant biomedical approaches. So much of what we know in mental health, our understandings of mental health through data and evidence, are built on normative experiences. Therefore, interventions which are evidence-based largely exist to mostly serve those comprising the normative and validate only the normative. In such a framework, the mental health field, which are the psi disciplines and its allies, become complicit at times in maintaining systems of oppression as yet another authority on how a person should function, what they should feel and behave like, while failing to take into account their lived realities and the socio-political context in which well-being is experienced, stress is experienced, or distress is experienced. It is often the case that distress, which is rooted in experiences of marginalization, is interpreted as an individual issue within the dominant frameworks, as something that the individual just needs to work on themselves. For these reasons, it is important that unique life stressors, contextualized by a person's socio-political locations and knowledge of those with lived experiences, are seen as legitimate data in mental health. Data which informs practice the same way that academically backed theories do. So in sort of all of this existing frameworks, I asked myself this question when I got to know of this conference is, where is the space for pleasure positivity in mental health work? And one of the things that came to my mind is that at the heart of pleasure, I think, are processes of meaning making and the freedom to make meaning for oneself. I see the potential to do this in communities, whether communities of shared geography, shared identities. And I see the potential in community-based and community-led approaches to mental health work for greater exploration of meaning making, because communities make meaning and support each other with or without narrow frameworks that try to dictate what is and isn't good or is and is not legitimate. And that goes for mental health frameworks too. For example, peer support methods have been long used as mental health care for communities who have not had access to traditional mental health care or have been pathologized by dominant mental health narratives. Communities know what data doesn't always show. We must always learn from the margins, as Aditi also greatly had put it there. And one example of the work that MHI partners do that always strikes me as a good example of the potential for community-driven mental health work to bring in the pleasure lens is that from a project in rural Uttarkashi district, Uttarakhand, where MHI partner grants asked persons with psychosocial disabilities or persons with mental health issues, as well as caregivers, how they cope with distress and what they find to be meaningful for their well-being. In this, women participants discussed gathering in groups and spending their day in natural surroundings, lingering over morning cups of chai, those moments. And a caregiver described coming to the fields before a day of work begins for a moment to themselves. These are methods that are common in experience, but not always common in documentation in mental health. Maybe because not many people ask. The other upsides of community-based, community-led psychosocial work is that these approaches are known to create greater access to care, to be more destigmatizing of mental health issues, because in such models, people access and receive care either from community members or in the context of their homes, their neighborhoods, their localities, as opposed to clinical or institutional contexts, which have associations of shame and stigma, where they would receive care from someone who may or may not understand the things surrounding their lived reality. The movement for community-based mental health work arose in part as a response to the inhumane institutionalizing models of mental health care. When one is institutionalized, as MHI partner organization Anjali, the founder of which is Ratna, puts it, institutionalization is not just about placing and keeping people in a building. Many things are taken from those institutionalized. The right to live in their communities, the right to make their own decisions about all kinds of healthcare, right to safety, and right to pleasure too. In rehabilitating and reintegrating institutionalized women into communities, a pleasure lens is also a means to restore dignity along with agency. The other potential I see for more pleasure-affirming work in mental health, and definitely a dire need in overall rights-based mental health work, are sensitized and affirmative practitioners that value pleasure and work with ideas of pleasure. I will stop here. I hope that's all right, Dipta.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And, Saisha, when you were talking, I was remembering something that I heard from Sharmila, who belongs to an organization called Ankur. And in a presentation where she was talking, and, I've worked in the area of development and education. And she was talking about an intervention that they were doing with young girls in bastis. And she said that just because you work on the margins doesn't mean that you come from a position of lack. Because a lot of development work is like you're lacking something, right? And so if girls are not going to school, you're lacking this, you live in a basti, you lack resources. And their entire project was on getting young girls to experience and young people to experience the pleasure of reading and writing, and to create the possibilities of them writing, becoming writers on their own. And they've been very successful. So I really I hear resonances, so much strong resonances to things that you're talking about, in terms of even in the kind of work that we do when we talk of margins, particularly in the area of love, sex, and looking at a more pleasure positive approach, is that we do really need to explore the margin as something that puts a sort of the light on new ways of seeing, experiencing, and understanding ourselves, rather than coming from a position of lack. And with that, I'd like to invite Gracy. Welcome, Gracy. And we'd really like you to share what a more affirmative approach looks like, or a pleasure positive approach on the ground looks like, and where are the domains within which. So is it only in the domain of mental health that we can look at it, or are there other domains where we need to, be bringing this approach and perspective in, which is pleasure positive?
Thank you. And thank you for this opportunity. It's such a great pleasure to be here. And I would like to start by saying that as I was listening to Saisha, it was almost like mirroring what I was thinking, what I always think about mental health. And it felt so good to hear you, Saisha. And yes, so I will not go into it, because that's what I was going to start off with, by saying that, this whole narrative about mental health it kind of distresses me sometimes when I hear people, when you talk about mental health, you're always thinking about depression, anxiety, suicide. And we really, now, in fact, we should realize how much mental health is part of all our lives. Everybody, it touches everyone. Especially the pandemic has made it so obvious. And it's so good to hear that perspective. And I think it's time for us to kind of move the narrative around mental health into more promotive, well-being perspective approaches to mental health. And to say, and to kind of, I'd like to say that at Cornerstone, we have been actually doing exactly this since for the last decade. In fact, when we started off our programs and we talked about emotional resilience, I used to talk about resilience. Nobody had heard about the word. People would ask you, what is this resilience? Today, you hear it in all contexts. You hear resilience to be talked in related to climate, resilient cities, resilient health systems. But what we have been actually doing, and some of this perspective comes actually from my own experiences as a researcher. So when I was listening to Aditi and I was listening to Saisha, I remembered I worked in Sangat as a researcher, and I used to be a qualitative researcher. So I used to do a lot of interviews with people who were screened as depressed. And when I spoke to them and I did my research interviews, I realized that the research and the scales that we use to kind of measure and say they're depressed are so kind of distant from their real lives that they were living. And that's when I kind of, my perspective on mental health changed. And I realized that, we need to look at it differently. And at Cornerstone, what we've been doing is we have been developing programs on emotional resilience. And this is entirely a strength-based program that is done in schools, in government schools, in Kasturba Gandhi schools, with girls in these Kasturba Gandhi schools who come from very vulnerable situations. And we train teachers to do these programs, which is not rocket science. These are simple skills that we teach them, but these are positive strength-based skills. We start off by actually getting them to understand their own strengths. And this comes from the field of positive psychology and character strengths. And these are strengths like simple things like creativity and bravery and kindness. And they learn to recognize these strengths in themselves, then they learn to recognize the strengths in others, in their peers, in their family. And then when you teach them many skills, such as setting goals for themselves or managing difficult emotions or stress, they're able to apply this throughout this journey of learning about themselves and learning to deal with adversity. And what we do is, what we focus is not just that young people have to deal with adversity, but thrive from it. So the skills are focused on really thriving. And we have not just worked now with the young people, we work with women in SAG groups, we work with parents and with preschool children. And we found that in all these populations, when you take this strength-based approach and help them to kind of be aware or recognize their strengths, they're really able to do a lot. And this, in fact, we have seen that it has an impact on many, many other outcomes. So like you bring in health, and it has an impact on health, the way they look at health, they look at their sexuality, the way they look at knowledge and behavior in health. You bring in parenting. We found that, parents from very low income settings were able to actually apply these recognized strengths and then apply it to their roles as parents. And even in a program with teachers, in fact, in teachers, we start off with training on something called attitudinal healing, looking at their own attitudes. And our first principle that we bring in is that love is the essence of all our lives. That's what we start off with teachers. And we really make them look at themselves and reflect on their own lives, their attitudes from a positive perspective, and which enables them to then play the role of teachers. So in this way, this program kind of brings in a different perspective. It also helps you to look that it can fit in anywhere. Like you said, where does this fit in? It can fit in within education. If you're looking at, health, or you're looking at livelihoods, how do you help people affirm themselves and then apply this to whatever they want to do, whatever roles they play in life. So that's what we've been kind of working in. And when it comes to data, so we started off our work with a lot of quantitative data around looking at self-esteem and looking at change in resilience, using scales and piloting them. And like Aditi said, it was questionnaires and pilots and adapting and trying to make sure that they understand this. But we realized over time that yes, these give you the numbers, but you really need to go in depth and do a lot of these qualitative workshops and interviews to really understand how people really not just understand the concept, but internalize what they learn. So we have adapted and have been using a lot of these other methods, like qualitative methods. In fact, when I started research in Bihar, I realized I was very excited about going and doing the interviews myself. And I realized that as a Goan who doesn't even really speak Hindi well, I did not really fit it. And I realized that I'm not going to, the kids are not going to tell me what they really feel or what they really experience. And I actually stopped my research, and I just trained people from Bihar and made sure that they understood. And that's why I'm bringing this up, is why it's important for the researcher to understand themselves and how they fit in with the people they're researching. So in Cornerstone, we have adapted and brought in a lot of qualitative methodologies to kind of capture what we're trying to study. So that's, I think I've kind of covered what you were asking me, Dipta. If you want me to say, like, elaborate on anything else, I can.
No, I think what we can do is, if we have a few minutes, which I think we might have, I just thought I'd give each one of you another 2-3 minutes if you'd like to contribute to each other's sort of, you've all spoken about what you're doing, but Aditi, would you like to respond to anything that you heard from that Gracie said or Saisha said? You can get 1 or 2 minutes. We can just have an open conversation amongst ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Dipta. It was honestly, for me, it was learning about everything that Gracie and Saisha do in their work. I've not had the opportunity to listen about mental health initiatives or generally health initiatives in the country. So it was a great learning experience for me. In fact, while you were talking, I was just thinking of how some of the things that you said could be sort of looked at in the places that I work, especially in remote areas of Northeast, where even the basic health infrastructure is not in place. But on the other hand, they have their own systems of traditional medicines where they use things from the forest itself. Now, as an NGO, sometimes we go with an agenda to improve things, which we assume that things are not already improved or something like that. So that was just what I was thinking. So if you have any advice, suggestions on how not to assume something before going and improving things. And secondly, this is again just a personal reflection, because I used humor in my book to talk about patriarchy in a way that I don't find it funny, but I think that it's a laughable concept. It should be laughed at and ridiculed and uprooted. So how do you find, is it very sensitive to use such dark humor in the context of mental health? It's a very, I mean, you cannot answer it also. Sorry if I did not make sense. Yeah.
So yeah, Saisha or Gracie, would you like to respond to that question on, does humor work when you're critiquing something and looking at something very painful?
It's a personal opinion, but I think, yeah, one has to be very careful on how one can use humor. It's if you're ridiculing somebody in power, I think it's a useful, or it's acceptable. But someone who's not in power, who's in pain, or who's, I think one would be careful about how one would use humor. Yeah, I would be, at least as a personal opinion. Yeah. And about the other things that you said, I think a lot of what Saisha was talking about, the organization that they're doing community work. In fact, we work with Buranza ourselves, and a lot of the learnings comes from this kind of work, where they go into communities and there's a lot of participatory kind of work that happens. So you work in partnership with the community to look at what exactly is that, what is that they need. I think Saisha would be able to say more about it, but that is how then we don't go with assumptions, especially with mental health. And you're right, sometimes they have their own traditional methods, and you cannot kind of say that this is not acceptable. One has to work with them. Yeah.
Thank you, Gracie.
Yeah, Saisha, would you like to add in something?
Sure. Yeah, I think in terms of humor, I think there's again a personal experience that the thing that needs to be ridiculed, I think, are the ways in which we don't, it's sort of like a unimaginable thing that you look at a person and not render agency to them, and why would you, on the basis of their mental health either. And I think there's sort of a feeling of like, how is this even possible? Why is this the world we're still living in? When I think about humor in terms of the work that is being done and all the work that still has to be done. But I think for making sure that we are responding to communities' needs, I think Gracie has put very well what community mental health work would do in that situation, and how that orientation to finding out what is needed is useful. I think similar things go for youth as well, and working in youth mental health, which Gracie, I'm sure you can also maybe add on to. But I found that it's so strange that the agenda is so often to mold youth into a function for society, a function for education system, a function for this, that, and the other. And the future of the nation, that's why you must invest in them. It's such a common tagline that is heard, but invest in them in ways that have been outlined for them. And this can be applicable to any sector, including the one that I work in, right? meaning making again never makes it to the agenda there. What is it that you make meaning out of when it comes to mental health, when it comes to education or health or various other things? So I think that is, one way to circumvent that is really just is to ask and to start valuing the knowledge and expertise of people who have the lived experience that we're trying to work with.
So
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to just say that I think a very important part of mental health is to be able to laugh at oneself. Because I think that humor is very important, because I think humor is political, just responding to your question, and that it can be a political tool where we are not always just talking about being victims, right? So if you don't want to be only in a victim and perpetrator mode, then it's very important to experience humor in your life. And that it's very important that we as people also find in whatever sort of spectrum we are on, what Saisha talked about, that we should be able to stand back and have a sense of humor about ourselves also. So I think in that sense, it's a good tool. And we need to be mindful of where and how we use it. But one thing I wanted to ask Saisha and Gracie in particular, that, in education, there has been all this talk for many decades now. At the end of 2000, turn of the millennial, there was this whole thing of life skill education. Young people were being given life skill education. Can you talk a little bit about how this kind of mental health positive, pleasure positive approaches are different, or are they similar to this life skill education that education department has been giving to young people for a long time?
I can start, and then maybe Saisha could add.
Yeah.
Is that I have been working with young people in adolescent health for more than 25 years and looked at life skills like for many years. And what I see is different is in life skills, when it was brought in, it's kind of a menu of different skills just put together, and then different organizations have taken them and churned it and added, either say livelihoods or other things to it, or sexuality or reproductive health knowledge. But it has been different kinds of skills put together, whether it's decision-making skills and taught in classroom settings to young people. Now you have different names for it. You call them social emotional learning or 21st century skills. All these are useful, but when it's promotive mental health, or when I talk about emotional resilience, difference is the focus is on dealing with challenges. So it's a lot on focus on how do you become aware of your emotions, how do you deal with difficult emotions, how do you navigate, how do you communicate and navigate and advocate for your needs when it comes to a stressful situation. So the focus of promotive mental health programs or the resilience programs that we do is more on coping, but coping and thriving from it, learning certain skills. While life skills includes some of the skills, but yet it's kind of a much broader area of different kinds of skills that different organizations have put together in different ways. That's how I see the difference.
So, Saisha, I thought maybe you could talk a little bit more about community-based models and how do you look at that? Because in world of development, we have all been working at community development models. How does the idea of pleasure and even leisure for those who are on the margins, how do they seek that? What do we learn from that? How does that become part of our understanding of the kind of work we should be doing, whether in education, development, not just in mental health? Can you talk a little bit more about how these community-driven things can be, giving us more in terms of adding to our work in development, education, and other areas also, not just in terms of sexuality?
Right. So I think benefits of community-based models are well known across various sectors in development as well. In mental health, the destigmatizing effect of community-based mental health work is also a key finding or a key process that a lot of people speak to, is that instead of receiving care in mental health, which has long been highly specialized and highly inaccessible and reserved for people to get that kind of care, instead of looking at clinic models or institutional models where you ostracize and put people away, and those are spaces where you may or may not have someone in front of you who understands the context of your daily life. When you look at communities and really using what communities know to support them better in any sort of space, then you start opening up these frameworks of this top-down idea that, this is what mental health is, or this is what education accomplishes and must accomplish, and this is why it means something for the people we are working with, and really flip that and allow that meaning that it already exists, right? And in the process, humanizing and rendering agency and dignity to the people you're working with. When you flip that process and ask them the questions of what does work for you? What do you actually want? And that wanting in terms of care or in terms of education or in terms of anything that can come under the sun of the work that is done in development has greater space to start discussing pleasure, for sure. I don't know if that properly answers.
Yeah. Good. I think we should open it up to the audience if there are any questions about the presentations. Any questions?
I think there would be some.
Yeah, I'm just looking at that. Shazia Qureshi says that can totally resonate with this. This was my experience by my peers and I as well on field. The men in our team were offered chairs and beverages, and we girls were made to sit on the floor. The men of the house would never speak to us or even look at us when we tried to converse. They only answered a question when the men from the group asked them. Okay, that's so, sort of learning. I'm sure a lot of us have experiences like that. Can you explain the resilience, resilience framing a bit more, especially how is this different from with different minority or marginalized communities? Gracie, maybe that question is for you. Another question, I'll just read out 3 questions and then people can take them up. Are there examples of how effective mental health resilience initiatives can change the social norms around pleasure, love, and sexuality? So that people are asking for in terms of norm change and particularly around pleasure, love, and sexuality. So maybe, you can all answer or respond to this. And the third question is, how can we create community awareness and support for mental health where it is not even acknowledged as an issue? So where people are kind of slipping it, it's so stigmatized that people don't want to talk about it. So how do we do community this thing? And then there is to Gracie in particular. I'm curious if you could share some stories of unexpected responses of young boys to the emotional learning curriculum. So we'll stop here for the time being. And yeah, if we can begin with resilience framing. Maybe Gracie, you can first respond to some of these questions and then we can come to the others. Yeah.
Yeah, I did not really understand the first question completely, but I'll just talk about when I say resilience. When we talk about resilience, we talk about the capacity to deal with adversity and thrive from it. And we look at it as a set of skills that are not innate, it can be taught. And we actually in our work only with marginalized communities. So we work in government schools, we work with self-help group women coming from very vulnerable situations. So we actually adapted the entire curriculum that was developed, and we've been using these, simplifying them through stories, working, and it's a peer support model where you facilitate the programs. It is facilitated by teachers when it comes to students, or community facilitators within the community. So it is facilitated by these people who are trained by us and done with vulnerable population, simplified, where they learn to understand these concepts and apply it to their lives. So that's the resilience framework or the program that we're using. And then about changing social norms around sexuality, that's a big challenge. Or about like in our work with teachers, we find that is the biggest challenge. It's just they kind of internalize many of these concepts around their own resilience or mental well-being. But when it comes to bringing in concepts of sexuality or of pleasure, it's a big challenge to even get them to talk about sexuality. So we do train them, and they are much more open after they go through the program on resilience, but it is a challenge. So that's been our experience. And about community awareness and mental health, what I would like to say is exactly what we've been saying in this conference, or in this session, is that we have to change the narrative around mental health. We have to make it everybody's problem, not problem, but a part of everybody's life. We have to make communities understand that mental health is part of their life, and it's not something that only some people who they consider as what most people say are mad, it is only their problem, or that's what mental health is. If we change the narrative around mental health and make people aware of it from that perspective, then I think we will also be dealing with stigma issues. So community awareness program need to change their narrative. So I think I've answered the question, but if there's something more that you all need.
There was a question about if you'd like to share some experiences of how some young boys have, or young men have responded to this. Yeah.
So what I would like to say is, when we started our program, we actually focused only on girls. The first trial that we did in Bihar was only with girls, but it was the boys that demanded the program, and they said, why are you only doing it for girls? And we then piloted the program with boys, and now we do it with girls and boys. And it's really, I wish I could kind of show you all some of the things that boys have been able to talk about when we even ask them to talk about emotions. They kind of are so amazed that they can, they also can describe emotions that they feel, that they've never been given opportunities to talk of in their household. And we found that in our program, when the boys learn about strengths, and they learn that there's no difference, that they have strengths as much as the girls have, or they learn about emotions, and they learn, there is a huge shift in their perspectives on gender. And that is something that we've seen in our work. But I think what is needed is a lot more that needs to be done, because social norms don't change. We have to kind of change the milieu. We have to do a lot more than what we're doing. But we do see these changes in the boys when we do the program for them.
Saisha, would you like to say something to these questions? Yeah.
Certainly, I think to echo some of Gracie's points as well, that it's
Aditi?
very difficult.
Aditi, would you like to say something? Yeah.
I think Gracie and Saisha sort of covered everything.
Somebody has asked a question about, can you make a connection between pleasure, whether of humor, art, or beauty, and emotional resilience? So lots of questions around emotional resilience and its connections to, so what are the forms? I think the person is trying to ask, like, what are the forms in which emotional resilience can be built? And what are the roles that humor, art, and beauty can play? So I think that is something that we can all also think about, not just Gracie. And there's another thing. I can understand that educationists need to be sensitized about differences in needs and generations. But somehow, as you say, they impose their own learned attitudes and unfortunately often scar the vulnerable individuals. How can you practically apply such awareness for educationists? Because merely implementing sex education for students does not lead to practical reality in their lives. So I think it's related to, sex education, norm change, sexuality education really being an important thing, and how teachers or the education system, can it respond to that or not? Why do you all think about the health? What do you think about the health card being proposed by the government? Will it centralize one entire health history? Health becomes state's data? Important question. Would you like to respond, Aditi, to the health card and or also art, education, humor, pleasure?
Yeah, I'll try. I'll start with the connection between humor, art, or beauty with emotional resilience. I can only speak from my experiences where I have seen communities, especially indigenous communities, just live with all the art and beauty around them, that they sort of reflect the beauty of the natural world into art that they create for their houses and clothes and all the handmade things and foods and the culture, tradition, everything. I don't know if that's directly connected to the kind of emotional resilience that they emanate when you speak to people. I'll give an example of a lady that I have also mentioned in my book. There's a region in Gujarat where there is a particular tribe that stays, and the bullet train is supposed to cut through that region. Now, they have a really beautiful house and they are quite content. So they don't really need the bullet train. They are not going to ride it anyways. But the resilience that they are showing in the face of the bullet train where they went and protested, I feel that a lot of it comes from the community feeling of just being close to nature is where they derive their strength from. Also, not individually, but as a community standing against something that they really don't need. And it is called as development, but again, everybody in the development sector sort of knows after a few years of experience that what is development and for whom it really is. So I think that those are my views on emotional resilience connected to art and beauty. Health card, I am not really an expert, but anything becoming state's data is dangerous at this point, I would say. So we have to be really careful about, firstly, whether there is even infrastructure available with the government so as to get this data and analyze it and make sure that it is not misused. Because we are seeing with Aadhaar card, especially now where I am in Assam and in Guwahati right now, and recently the Sipajar incident happened, which was it was criminal, and turned out that one of the victims had an Aadhaar card, and there was this entire narrative built around the fact that, oh, you can just get an Aadhaar card at 300 rupees at the Assam-Bangladesh border. But so the entire idea of the Aadhaar card being as an identity or not being as an identity is being questioned right now. So anything that the citizens sort of give to the state, I think it has to be first made sure that it won't be misused. I think I'll end at that.
Yeah. Gracie, Saisha, would you like to respond to those questions?
I'll just kind of respond to two. One is that how can beauty and art be kind of integrated? The way I see it is that emotional resilience is like a core skill. It's a core within you, and the minute you kind of build that core and make people aware of their emotions, trends, and their aspirations, and how to act on it, you can then make them look at beauty and art or anything that you want to, because you're just building that core. So it's you can bring in any other aspect. In fact, when you build resilience, even among vulnerable populations like the girls that we see in the KGBVs, we do see them actually coming up with so much of creativity on how they can express these things, and through drawings and art and dance and music that they do within the school. So they bring in the things that they learn through this. So it's very easy to kind of integrate beauty and art within when you build the core. So what is important to do is to build that. The second thing is about education. Is I'm not sure whether I understood the question, but the way I would respond is that when we develop programs, we always kind of look at it in silos. So it's sexuality education, it's mental health, it's promoting mental health, it's something on livelihoods or educational programs. We don't realize that it's the same individual, the same adolescent, the same youth that we're doing the program. So if you can look at it in a holistic manner, where you bring in sexuality in the same way that you help people internalize promotive mental health and emotions, you also help them to internalize their own experience of sexuality. If we can do that with educationals and teachers, then we would move a long way in kind of getting all this in focus. And that's my kind of answer to that.
I had a question, actually. I'm just sort of pushing, and maybe we can all respond to it. Others can. That I think that education, the question that person's asking also is this whole thing of, and you also mentioned it about teachers. About it's really difficult because teachers come with their own attitudes of sexuality. They're adults. They have their own very strong ideas of shame, stigma. This is appropriate, not appropriate. While a lot of young people may still be exploring, they are in a different phase of their life. And so this interaction, sometimes, why I asked the question on even life skill education, can mostly become about saying no. Say no to sex before you are 21, or say no to sex before marriage. This is what it meant in terms of sexuality education. And at the same time, the sites of learning about sexuality today for young people are very different. They're not in the education system. They are on social media. People are of various groups, communities, chatting. Agents of Ishq has been working on that idea and getting people to talk, where they're sharing and really strengthening that voice. So when we are talking so my question actually really is that in this time and moment, is the education system the appropriate place to be talking about resilience, or emotion, being in touch with our emotions when we are young, with young people, boys, girls, people from different communities with different mental and emotional states? Or is it just that it's a place where everybody is coming, yet the education system can also be very status quoist? So how do we then bring in this approach? Where is it best located, and how do we do it? So I have that question about, when we are looking at pleasure positive approaches, or even in communities when we start talking of leisure, who has leisure? Time use surveys in India showing poor women, Dalit women, tribal women, no time for leisure. And quality of life is deteriorating. So how do we promote the idea of leisure and pleasure for people? Because the rich do have the leisure and pleasure. They have the resources to have it. So how do we, so what Saisha was talking about in terms of, so those are questions I had also. If you'd like to just add your thoughts or experiences in this. Or we could look at the people in the audience have something to say about that. We can open it up to the audience. What do you think? People have talked about education it's not just a matter of intergenerational, it's a matter of, and a lot of our teachers belong to upper caste communities, powerful communities in local context. So how do you make that change happen? How do you transform it? Yeah.
Anyone?
Okay, they can type. I think they can respond in questions. But Saisha, you or Gracie, would you like to respond in terms of experiences with teachers and the limits and what are the limits and how do we then look at other domains? Are there other domains?
Yeah, I completely kind of am with you in terms of limitations. It is difficult to work with these existing norms and with teachers, and they come up with their own own baggage and own norms and own kind of backgrounds, and there are caste discrimination. There's all this that exists within the structural systems that we have. But at the same time, I think that we cannot say that these schools are a space where the kids and teachers are there. What it needs is a lot of intense work. So it's not just lip service. So, and that's a challenge, especially when it comes to scale up, when you're working with the government in training hundreds of teachers and getting them to kind of do this kind of work. It's a big challenge. How do you because when we started our work, it was intense training, spending many hours to change attitudes, to get teachers to really, understand and internalize and then accept these differences in sexuality. There were, we had master trainers, males, who were not even ready, who didn't want to utter certain words. They didn't want to say it. But with the training, when you bring in resilience and these concepts, they moved a lot in terms of at least being able to express this, and they were willing to express it in front of training teachers. So it takes some time and effort, but it also we should be conscious of the intensity that is required in terms of training. The second thing is, I know that schools are not the only space. It is one of the spaces we have to use because that's where everybody is coming in. But with social media, I think it has to be wide, it has to be multi-pronged. It can't be just one space. We have to use what young people go to. We have to get parents to be aligned to what is the life of the young people and to be able to know what's happening and get them aware also. So it has to be kind of multi-pronged apart from just the schools, You have to use social media, you have to use other channels to reach out. So, yeah.
I think we have some more questions, or just let me scroll down. Somebody has said, I strongly feel from my own experience as a teacher that we must sensitize educationists because I have seen far too many young individuals feel defeated at such a young age. Hence, I wanted to ask exactly what you voiced. How do we implement it? So that's one. Somebody said you spoke about exclusionary social structure. What can we do more to be more aware of them and dismantle them? That is another question. And in the long run, we need to decolonize our notions of education and how the education system is set up. In the more medium term, the whole school approach to equity, rights, and well-being needs to be applied with individual schools. Training a few teachers is not enough. Um, then, um, great question, but tech access seems to be the barrier quite unsurprisingly. The internet is a great space to do this work, but how many girls in rural Bihar will have access to a smartphone of their own to watch sexuality content? That's a very good observation. My humble request, you are the movers and trainers. Please do try to figure out some steps that can be implemented. Yes, parents too, because it's when parents can't help the child seek supports from the teacher. So, any responses to these observations?
What was the first question? I couldn't understand. What was the first?
Those are more like observation. One is the thing of experiences as a teacher. How do we implement this sensitization? I think Gracie has responded to that. That you have to run those training programs. Scaling up is an issue. People come with their own baggage, their own sort of stigma. And then how do we approach individual schools where training, not just teachers, but the entire school system, somebody is asking. And then technology as a barrier, because I raised this question about people learning from other spaces. And somebody's asking us for steps. What do we do that can be implemented? So I don't know if Saisha, you could share some experiences of people trying to implement certain things.
Sure. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think in terms of being able to implement community-based work that is in mental health, for example, that dismantles social structures and also makes sure to facilitate greater access, I think one is to first and foremost understand what it is that communities know and feel and work from there, right? As opposed to coming with a predetermined idea about what mental health work might need to look like and co-creating what those interventions might be. Where is the access, right? If technology is not an access point for a particular community, what are the other accesses, and where can we also create accesses? I think we have to be more creative about the ways in which we do it, because I think it's relevant to the point that someone asked about state and health data. Tech-based mental health solutions are, a hot commodity right now, and probably will continue to be in this space as well. But those are also existing in context of social structures of who has access, for who that kind of literacy about data and privacy, mental health data and privacy might not be accessible in order for that act to make sense for half of them. Technology does also have the power to also reach people who may not be able to seek support elsewhere. So there's sort of a contextualizing and a balancing that needs to happen to begin with. And I think for school, for work with young people especially, I think school is seen as a central site, right? And perhaps rightfully so. It's where a lot of young people also do spend their time. I think it's equally important to look at what are the other contexts that young people are experiencing apart from the dynamic of, just being a young person in school. It's about, is this education system going to be conducive to well-being in the long term, as someone rightfully mentioned? And also, what are the other locations with which a child comes to the school, right? It's their student, they are also experiencing life in the gender that they are, in the sexuality that they are, in the past location they come from. And that experience does not get left at the door when they walk into a school either, right? And someone mentioned about how teachers bring their own perspectives from their lives and their realities into the teaching that they do. And I think one way to balance that out is, again, to hand over the mic and to actually ask young people, what is it that you need, and how is it that we can support you, as opposed to predetermined ways of interacting that, we good to have as tools, or good to have as knowledge that, this is something we could realistically do. But to work more specifically and more contextually, I think it's always a good rule of thumb. I don't know if I answered exactly what was going on, just some thoughts that came on with all the excellent points and questions that have been made.
Okay. Would anybody like to add? Otherwise, I will wind up. Yeah? Yeah? Okay, so thank you to Aditi, Gracy, Saisha, to YP Foundation, and to Agents of Ishq for organizing this. I think we are, left with a lot of questions at the end of this discussion, which is good, because I think that as people even in the chat box are asking us, what are the ways in which, it's really, we're beginning to look at this question of the embodied nature of our existence. It has been seen in particular quarters, but the fact that your mind and body are embedded and located in social structures is a very, very critical idea. I think that we have been trying to, work through, and how this experience of being embodied actually then helps us to look at things in new ways, as Aditi talked about, being curious, looking at things afresh, and trying to make meaning out of experiences which are from the margins, which have not been seen, which have maybe been articulated, but articulated in particular ways. But how do we sort of do that process of actually making meaning and exploring the idea of pleasure in that context? Because particularly in the area of mental health, as has emerged, and I think it's really, really important, I just want to underline it, is that capitalist approaches inform not just our imaginations of what is normal, normative, but it also pushes us in the direction of more individualized treatments, and which only a few people and only the elite have access to: psychiatrists, to counseling, to therapy. What happens to the public at large? I mean, I think in a country like India, that is a question we do need to ask very sharply, particularly in the context of COVID as it came up. And therefore, I hear the panelists talk about really community-led models, community-initiated models, and which are peer-to-peer models. We are not looking at this capitalist dream of great autonomy and great agency of one individual. So I think this model is really telling us about interdependence, that, we are looking at a model that promotes the idea of interdependence on each other, and how do we create those things, and which also means that greater focus on public spaces, models, interventions, and steps that actually bring us into that possibility of creating those community-led, community-based models. So I think this, and how do we, because we don't experience ourselves in these segmented ways, we experience ourselves in our communities, creating new communities also, and also existing communities, making the mind-body connect and our emotional well-being as embedded there, and not in some solitary space of being, in development, they keep saying, oh, she's a great icon or she's a great heroine. Those poor heroines are always sort of, hanging in some outer space, and so embedding and therefore sort of changing. I think the challenges are immense, as we know. We are a society that is driven by stigmatized ideas of body, of purity, of pollution, of what is appropriate, and particularly in the area of mental health and emotional well-being, we are a community and a society and a nation that is very quick to categorize and to name and blame. And so pressures come from modernity and capitalism. And so that is the big challenge. And in spaces like education, there are possibilities of exploring and orienting, as our audience is also saying, that of course that domain has to be there because young people are in need of that more healthier learning where your emotions also connect with all the informative learning, etc., that you may be being taught in school. And your sense of well-being needs to be very well located. So I think that pleasure positive approaches for me, what I've understood, are community-led, are public-led. Those interventions are there in whatever ways that we know of them, but more need to be made. And I think more than an output-driven orientation of our interventions where we are looking at, did we do this output? What was the output? Which is an important sort of driver today in a lot of the ways in which interventions with young people are being seen. Are they completing school? Are they performing well in class, as we started out saying? But to really look at new ideas of well-being, of progress, of development, of equality, and having rights. So I think that was one important thing. And finally, I think that not just a question that somebody asked from the audience, which was very important, is that what is the place of art, music, a play, sport, and in our lives? And what does that add to our sense of pleasure? And as Saisha said at the end, co-creating it. Because I think communities can also be very insular. So how do we co-create? How do we create and push for those interventions, which then allow us to have more people creating, not specialists creating, and have the voices and the experiences and the joy of a lot more people who are there. So I'd just like to say that. And finally, about data, I think that what we see, how we see, that's constantly something that needs to keep intersecting. And I think we are pushing ourselves to look at different ways of gathering data, and yet also we should be concerned about how that data is used, because data also, we live in a society where data has tremendous power and control, what Aditi pointed out. And we do need to be mindful of giving access to state or to other agencies to have control over our bodies and control, and therefore to determine how we think or feel. So we need to be all out there exploring and interrogating and creating at the same time with others more pleasure positive ways of being. So thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers and to the speakers, to the tech team, to the interpreters for this wonderful experience. It's been most learning for me also, and I'd like to end here. Thank you.